Today, plenty of snakes, not many ladders. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, our latest post covering finance and property news. And I'm pleased to say that on a Friday afternoon, independent journalist Tarric Brooker is back. Hi, Tarric. How are you going?
Good, mate. It's great to be back.
Good to see you. And we were just saying before we started, it's crazy, and it feels like a bit of a game. And the game is rigged insofar that there are lots of snakes and not many ladders.
Yeah, it's certainly looking that way, isn't it? You've got the sort of fight against inflation that isn't quite going as well as it should be, and then you look at some of the other pieces of economic data from where you name it, and they're really not impressing. And I think we're on a little bit of a knife edge in some ways that things could go south quite quickly if the economy really starts to turn. And because I think in a lot of ways, it's been really quite volatile for some time now, where you've had this services sector holding things up, but the question is, how long can it keep doing that?
Well, it is interesting. If you stand back and just look at the UK as a sort of an analog, right? We had the inflation number reported at 2.3% in the UK, which is just slightly above the 2% target. But it's only because there were huge cuts in energy prices. The services was very, very strong. And overall inflation is way more rocky than that headline number might look. But of course, the Rishi Sunak decided to get a bit drenched on down 10 Downing Street, but actually announced an election, right, based on that good news. And it's interesting because I think you could almost say there's an analogy in Australia. We've seen a slight reduction in the forward view of power. We know that in the recent budget, there's a little bit of incentive to actually push prices down. So the headline number will drop a bit, but of course the headline number really doesn't tell you what's going on. And it's the services, it's the second round impacts of inflation, which are really very sticky. And in New Zealand, of course, Adrian Orr, this week in the monetary policy statement, turned more hawkish, really, and said, look, we may even have to put rates higher. Hopefully we won't have to, but there isn't a chance that rates will get cut anytime soon. So, it is very different from what the top line spin from politicians would to have you believe.
Well, I think that's the thing, with the release of the budget, which we haven't actually spoken about, having a chance to speak about yet. It's they're very much willfully distorting things. I mean, on shortly after the budget was released, you had CBA coming out and saying, well, this is going to suppress headline inflation by 0.75 percentage points, which is a fairly significant suppression of inflation. And part of the problem as well is that eventually these subsidies are going to end, and then all that impact is going to come rushing back in at the start of sort of what will be the 2025-2026 financial year. But there's a very important thing about that. That's going to happen after the election.
Yes.
So it's going to be, the next term's problem. So, that is a fairly significant inflationary time bomb right there, because, that the Albanese government, when it initially introduced the previous round of electricity subsidies, I think they did so in the hope that power prices would fall more significantly than they did. In the end, the weighted average of power prices covered by the Australian energy market operator on the here, in the East Coast and really just everything but the West, only fell by about 1.7%. So it was much, much, much smaller of a fall than was expected. So, now they've gone and they've kicked the can again. And despite the fact that the actual per unit cost of electricity has come down significantly, the issue is that the pole and wires and the infrastructure and the grid and the renewables and the closure of the older power stations and all these things is all costing untold amounts of money, which is pushing up the other component of electricity prices, and that's going to continue into the future. Especially because we've got AI data centers, we've got renewables, we've got basically a big shift in the grid of where is power being generated and where is power being consumed, all of which is going to cost money. So, we've got this inflationary time bomb, but that's That's, 2025's problem.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same as in the UK, where clearly the election is being called at the time when inflation is looking as though it's coming down a little. Consumer confidence is just slightly higher in the UK than it was. But looking ahead, inflation is going to take off again. In fact, the Bank of England is already suggesting that inflation will be higher later in the year and into next year. So there's that little window of opportunity. So this is pure politics. And unfortunately, it's clear to me that some of the commentators are actually, playing that same game. They're looking at the short-term window rather than the strategic stuff. And the data is all over the place. And of course, employment data in Australia, and we'll probably get into that in more detail a bit later, right? But look at the numbers there and how it's wobbled around. It's very hard to get a compass at all.
It is, and I think that's really just part of the problem at the moment. The data is very much all over the place, and if you look at historic economic cycles, in a lot of ways, it's contradictory. You look at various, say for example, in the US, the leading indicator index, um, it has not been in contraction this long without it there being a recession in the past. So there's that real sort of breaking with what is traditional norms. And that's something that we're going to get into later on in the show, just in terms of, say, for example, how the evolution of per capita spending here in Australia has evolved, in the sense that it used to be, at least according to the RBA's analysis, say 7 or 8 years ago, that once a household got to, say, 54 over the age of 54, spending started to drop. And while that remains the case, it's not dropping off anywhere near as substantially as it used to previously. So that's something that we can touch on later on in the show.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, of course, that the Productivity Commission came out with a report talking about the unequal distribution of wealth and how actually most of the property and superannuation wealth sits in the older age cohorts now, and that means that there's a significant amount of distortion in terms of equality in Australia. First point. Other interesting observation, of course, that the context also of markets, because markets have been banking on rate cuts, and the rate cuts are getting kicked out. But we've got the AI supercycle going on as well, and that's actually supporting the markets. The NVIDIA results came out and creating an astonishing increase on last time. In fact, if you look at the NVIDIA stock alone and the value of that, it's bigger than the Australian share market overall. So it gives you a sense of context. But there's an interesting observation. I don't know whether you saw this, but there was a film a couple of decades ago called Colossus, the Forbin Project. And that was about AI effectively taking over the world and becoming dominant and controlling humanity. Guess what? That particular film has disappeared from all of the streaming services all over the place. Now, don't call me a conspiracy theorist, but it's interesting that a story about AI taking control of the world has disappeared.
No, the AI one's a funny one to me because, in some ways, we're not there yet. It's, in terms of it's called artificial intelligence, and like, I guess that's true to a degree, but in the sort of, more, shall we say, media sense of things, and like when you think about how AI is in a film or in a television show, it's very, very different to what we're seeing in front of us now. It's very much, but by the same token, I think one of the things that's the most fascinating about that is that it's not so much that it needs to be true AI in order to have a significant impact on society. All it needs to do is be good enough that it can, I don't know, it can replace someone at this is something that's already happening in the US, but it can replace someone at a window at McDonald's. It can have, the voice recognition to the point where it's accurate enough. It's not perfect, but it's accurate enough that it's serviceable. And I think that that's one of the sort of key things about the whole AI debate, is that it's not so much that it's going to be perfect, because that's going to take a whole lot longer. But in terms of it being serviceable enough to replace a fallible human is, I think, a different kettle of fish. And, if we go all the way down the rabbit hole to what some of the, the futurists and all these commentators are talking about in terms of, AI taking over and, perhaps justifying some of the stock prices that we're seeing in some of these companies, is you're going to destroy the consumer base of economies, because the consumer bases are people, are households. So, what happens then? Do we just continue? Do we just see an accelerated shift towards, these, mega wealthy people doing, the overwhelming majority of consumption, which in a lot of cases they already do? Or do we, what happens then? What happens with unemployment? Does a young labor force, a young large labor force, all of a sudden become a liability rather than a benefit? There's all these questions that need to be answered about that, but we just rush headlong into the future.
Yes, and of course, some people are saying, well, we'll need to have universal basic income or something, otherwise that people will effectively not be employed. They won't need to be employed because the more basic work will be done by AI. So there is a concerning future, and one which I think some of the commentators are actually probably over egging the problem, but I also think that there's a very significant strategic question that we should ask. I also make the point, as you do, that AI, of course, is based on information that's out there in the cloud. That information is created by fallible humans. So guess what? AI is fallible at the moment too, right? So, you can't always believe all the hallucinations that you read.
Yeah, well, there was a good one this morning that someone shared on Twitter that showed that the Gemini AI was asked for a cure for depression, and one of them said, well, one user suggested that it could be solved by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, I don't think that's terribly helpful advice.
Now, there was another one with a pizza recipe suggesting that they put a bit of glue in the pizza recipe to glue the cheese on the pizza, right? So that was because some back in history, somebody had actually suggested that as a joke.
Garbage in, garbage out, eh?
Exactly. That sounds like economics. Well, we better get on with the show, as Edwin would have complained by now that we're actually messing around. So let's get on with the. You've put a lot of effort in these slides, and this first one, of course, is absolutely brilliant. Apparently, inflation wasn't transitory after all, as the whole ship goes sideways.
Well, as usual, folks, the charts will be available at avidcom.substack.com. I have a couple of paid articles that are going to be coming soon. The vast majority are still going to remain free, but a guy's got to make a living. So if you would like to subscribe, that would be very, very much appreciated. And yeah, that would be great. And if you are in a particular line of work, if this could be tax deductible for you, and we are heading for the end of financial year, so if you were to subscribe, that would really do me a great favor. And even if you're not, if you just want to just subscribe to the free service, that's great too. And we'll get right into the slides. Now, this is what Martin was referring to earlier in terms of the changes and revisions to the Australian unemployment numbers. Now, I think that this is really a quite important one, mostly because it paints very, very different pictures of the labour market for the RBA. Now, if you're the RBA and you're thinking, well, we think unemployment's going to go to, 4.2, 4.3%, and you're looking at the March numbers and you're going to go, well, that's pretty good. We're seeing, unemployment has sort of hit a bit of a hump there, to quote Christine Lagarde. And, you're just sort of thinking, well, things are going okay. And it was a similar story in February. But then April comes along, everything gets radically revised, at least in relative terms, and all of a sudden unemployment is on the uptrend again. And it's just like, well, a couple of bad months, and all of a sudden you're going to be knocking on the door of the RBA's unemployment target quite a bit earlier than expected, and then that dramatically alters the course of the economy and potentially the course of monetary policy. So it's a bit of a mess in that regard.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, isn't it, that there's a couple of reasons why the data is moving around. Firstly, of course, the question is, what is the divisor? So, what is the working population, including, of course, the very strong migration that we've had? And a lot of the our suggestions are that maybe that divisor is not accurate. The second is that the surveys themselves are not actually necessarily capturing all the nuances, and they're having difficulty. In fact, survey problems in unemployment are also showing up in the US and in the UK and other places too. So it's not just an Australian problem. And thirdly, the move to part-time versus full-time is also in there as well. And there are some quite significant shifts around. Plus, of course, the question is hours worked, is it as strong or weaker? So there's so many unknown unknowns, and the sampling mechanism, they report that the going in and the going out each time, and they say, well, it's not necessarily going to impact the results. But when you actually look at the outgoing employment rate much lower than the incoming employment rate, that's going to move the dial too. So there are so many unknown unknowns, and this is a critical compass element for the RBA. So how do they make sense of it? Can they?
No, exactly. And, the thing is, if you look at all the various other indicators, from job indices, job ads, job openings, all across the board, government figures, private sector, you name it, they're all pointing to varying degrees to deteriorating levels of jobs growth. Now, some are pointing to it more seriously than others, but the problem is that because the labor force growth is so high because of immigration, we're seeing this very, very difficult situation whereby even though we are creating what would normally be more than enough jobs to keep the unemployment rate static, it's rising because we can't keep up. So that's one of the reasons why going forward, the migration target being hit is going to be absolutely vital for the Australian labour market. If Treasury gets the numbers wrong again and the migration figures for the second half of this year come in significantly higher, then that's a lot. We could end up seeing, 60, 70, 80,000 more people or more who will need to then find jobs in order for the unemployment rate to not rise. So it's pretty challenging in that regard.
Yeah, and it's have to be said that the numbers so far this year are a lot higher than, if we can use the same trend, than would actually match with the Treasury forecast for this year, right? And they've had a really good history, haven't they, of accurately, quote unquote, accurately assessing the view of where the migration numbers will be. They've basically under forecast it pretty much every year for the last few years.
Yeah, it's really quite a mess in that regard. And I think that there really needs to be a greater level of accountability and a greater level of, I don't know how to describe it other than accountability, because basically if you screw this up, say for example when they screwed up their biggest screw up when they said that migration would be 235,000 and ended up being over 500,000, right? That's, hospital beds for 270,000 people that you need to find. Teachers, schools, roads, hospitals, you name it. There's all these different things that you need to find then for 270,000 people. And that's a lot. That's a whole lot of people. It's the size of some small countries, and there needs to be a greater sense of, well, we need to get one, you need to get it right, and two, if you screw it up, there needs to be a mechanism by which the quality of services is restored. The number of that there is some degree of they talk about the migration catch up. Well, we need an infrastructure catch up and a services catch up to keep up with the mistakes that have been made.
Spot on. And one of the interesting observations there is that the high numbers that we've now got have then created a political platform for both parties to say, oh, we're going to reduce the migration. So there's actually, an intent from a political spin perspective to pull the migration numbers down, although it's mostly students perhaps rather than others. And there's some big debates about whether it's really going to happen. But the reality is at the moment, the numbers as reported in the ABS, the last set of numbers, are still very high. And of course, it's become a political football. So effectively, both sides of politics are now playing playing with these rather important points. And then, of course, you've got the business lobby still saying, well, we still can't get the workers, and we still don't want to have to pay what we should pay. So there is a huge political and economic stink here. But the baseline point is that the numbers are unreliable coming out of the ABS. So we're not on firm ground at all. In other words, it's snakes and ladders.
It's a really quite challenging one because it is such an important figure for the labor market, for the infrastructure, for the government, for everything. And I think that it's really just worth reflecting that this isn't normal, that even the level of migration that Australia had prior to the pandemic was not at a globally normal level. I think it's ironic that, in the UK at the moment, there's this big debate around migration, which recently come in at a bit over 600,000. But Britain's population is more than double ours. Yet we have a migration figure that's roughly in the same ballpark. Yet in Britain, in Canada, it's much, much more serious political issue where there's actually sort of serious consideration being paid to reducing it to a far greater degree than here in Australia. I mean, even what we've seen, say for example, from Peter Dutton and the coalition is, okay, we're going to reduce the permanent intake. Well, what are you going to do about the temporary intake? Oh, something, 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 cut, limit numbers of students, something, something. It's very much a vague sort of thing. And, this is something that they've done before. They've cut permanent migration before, and then temporary migration has ended up rising to meet that fall. So it's all very much a political football, but I don't think that there is anything like the level of commitment required or seen elsewhere to actually doing something meaningful about it. I mean, there was an article in the Australian Financial Review today which basically said that the Treasury strategy, and this is a quote from a former current Liberal MP, but former member of the government, who basically said, well, Treasury's thing is just basically keep the hammer down and keep migration going, and that's going to keep the economy ticking over. Even though the reality is that Australia's last decade, in terms of per capita GDP growth, despite all of the enormous windfall that we've seen from the green revolution, from lithium exports, from the rise of Australia as an LNG export superpower, we have had a worse decade in per capita terms than Japan during its lost decade. So, people say, oh, well, it's for the economy. It's like, well, the economy is performing shit. Why do we want this?
Well, that's absolutely. So in real terms, people have gone backwards for a long, long time. And none of the so-called interventions will necessarily impact that. I also make the point that we've got this other spurious argument about education being the second biggest export, except, of course, that more and more of those students who are actually now coming from places, including other than China, are actually having to work in Australia to cover the fees for learning in Australia, which, by the way, they're probably working longer than they should, based on the law. But you can't really argue that that's an export. So actually, the basic fundamental economic theory here is wrong. And of course, the university sector is completely reliant on this massive degree factory mentality that they've developed over the years, which means that they're calling poor and the government's saying, well, go build some more student accommodation then and keep pumping.
It's really quite striking because if you look at the figures, the government figures on the number of university students in Australia on visas, so it's not, counting all of them, but just the ones on visas, that number since 2012, since they started compiling these big biannual reports, has risen by about 150%. So there's roughly 2.5 times the number of university students, international university students, as there was a little over a decade ago. And then you go, well, what are we getting out of it? What are we as a nation? What are the students of our university getting out of it? fees keep going up. You think that that this enormous expansion would have been able to basically subsidize an enormous number of local students, but that's not what's happening. And just on the topic of exports, I just find it kind of crazy that you can come here on a working visa, right? Say a 6-month working visa, you can come here, you can pick fruit, you can, work in a mine, you can do whatever, right? And you go get a sandwich. That's not an export. That's local domestic economic activity. If you do a 4-year degree at a university and you go buy a sandwich, that's an export. That makes no sense to me.
Oh, it's not.
And and in a lot of other countries that don't measure it that way, it doesn't make sense to them either. But that's just the way it works. And I really would love to see what Australia's trade balance actually looked like once you ripped that particular thing out and just included the tuition rather than, I mean, and even then, that's cash in a lot of cases that's earned in Australia. So is that really an export? Like if you're paying for something with local currency that was earned in that domain, is that an export? I mean, Cameron Murray's got a great article on this. You should link that in the description if you're aware of it.
No, I'm aware of it, and yes, indeed, I've referred to it many times because to me, this is a nonsensical situation where, in fact, we're making bad policy decisions because of a bad economic structure, because of effectively a way of accounting that's not right. So, it's a vicious circle. Another example of snakes and ladders. We should probably get on to the next slide, Tarric, or we're going to be here all day.
Yeah, yes, we probably will. Now, I've been saying for a long time that Australia's wage setting is broken. That even under ideal conditions, that wage setting that the wages really wouldn't get off the canvas relative to the rest of the world. And I copped a lot of crap for this. People are like, well, no, Australia's wages are going to take off, the wage spiral, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't happen. Australia's wages peaked much, much lower than the rest of the world, much lower than the UK, certainly, and lower than the US as well. Now, as well, not only that, but I've cherry-picked the employment cost index here from the US, not the Atlanta Fed wages growth. If it was the Atlanta Fed wages growth, I'd need a different scale because it would be that much higher. But I just think it's worth noting that Australia just doesn't have the settings to produce strong wages growth. And that, in a lot of ways, I think really complicates monetary policy, or at least it should complicate monetary policy. Because if you've got an economy that can only sustainably generate maybe, let's call it wage growth in the sort of mid to high twos, and you've got an inflation target that's 2 to 3%, and you've got inflation at 2.3, 2.4, how are you supposed to dig yourself out of that hole that you're in terms of, all of this wages growth that's been lost over the last couple of years in real terms? How are you supposed to dig yourself out of that when the amount of time that it's going to take is measured in decades under anything approaching a sort of, reasonable scenario?
Yeah, a couple of interesting observations. You've got there the private sector wages growth, which of course is the the buoyant part of the economy, at least it should be. Public sector wages growth in Australia has actually done a little better than private sector quite often. Funny that. And we've actually got an increase in the number of people working in the public sector across the country at the moment relative to what we used to have. But the bottom line story here is the prospect of significant real-term wages growth in Australia is close to zero. And that's a really astonishing thought, bearing in mind that most people, I think, in Australia believe that wages are fantastic. There's a fundamental mismatch here. And I guess it's because it's basically back to the political dialogue.
Yeah, well, we'll just go to the next slide because this actually covers the real wages growth thing quite well. But this is Australian real wages since the wage price index started in 1997 and has been deflated by the headline CPI. Now, for a while, we've seen the government say, look, real wages are rising. You see that little upturn? That's your wages rising. Yay. And for a while, we've seen them quote quarter on quarter figures and go, yeah, we're doing real good. We're moving forward. And recently, the quarter-on-quarter figure fell. So if we sort of apply the government's own yardstick there, things have deteriorated. But I think that the trajectory of that little line there really just illustrates the challenge of getting back to where we were prior to the pandemic. Now, I'm not even talking about this blow off top that we saw as people left, as migrant workers left during the pandemic, that we saw early on, and unemployment rates that we saw early on during the pandemic. I'm just not talking about where we were in 2019. Getting back to that is going to take a long, long time. And I just think that that's really just, it's really quite amazing, to be completely honest with you. And not only that, but this is headline wages growth. If you look at the wages growth levels for people who are aged between 18 and 35, they're basically at late 90s to early 2000s levels of wages growth. Sorry, of real wages. And that's just ridiculous. People say, oh, well, young people are just whingers. No, they're not. They have been absolutely shafted to the greatest degree in terms of real outcomes of any Australian generation over this level of time since the Great Depression. And that's a fact.
So, yeah. So one of the interesting things I think on this one, and this is a really, really critical slide because it's, again, not one that many people want to talk about, is the distribution across cohorts is absolutely fundamental here, right? And I see this in my surveys. So a lot of younger cohorts are absolutely against it because they've had no wages growth in real terms for a long time. People are actually joining the market, and coming in as a lower, more entry level. The other observation in the year 2000, of course, there was that big peak up, and I suspect that's also to do with some of the other handouts and things that were actually wrapped around the COVID support. But the most recent little downturn should be really concerning to people. Remember, inflation is coming down, not as fast as some people are saying. But what this is saying is that the momentum around wages growth is continuing to get weaker. Now, that's a really bad position to be in the battle for inflation and in the battle for standards of living.
It is. And I think that the thing as well is that even if you look at wages growth from, say, let's call it, say, like 2013, and then through to around, just before the pandemic, wages over that six year, almost 7 year period, the real wages still only expanded by not much more than 1%. And that's just a frankly pathetic outcome. And I think as well that once you get into the distributional side of things, the biggest beneficiaries are 55 and over, 45 to 54. Those demographics have seen significantly more wages growth than the younger demographics. And I think it's fairly clear why, because you've got this level of growth of migration at roughly that level. I mean, this is something that we talked about in our last show, but we're consistently growing that sort of 25 to 34 age group, and then turning around and going, why is wages growth crap? Because the problem is that when you're expanding the labor force in such a targeted way, well, what else is going to happen? It's basic supply and demand. And then obviously, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the older cohorts who are seeing the benefit of the additional aggregate demand, who are doing, well, I'm not going to say great, but they're doing better than those at the younger end of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a lot of businesses have been howling at the lack of available cheap workers. And so they are actually wanting more younger people to come in as cannon fodder to be able to pay less, to be able to actually make more profits. So there is a rather worrying economic trend here. And, the Financial Review had an article, again, focusing on what business want. Funny that. because what they want is, a pantheon of really cheap workers. In other words, more imports of people, younger people, who they can pay less.
I'm going to go off on a bit of a rant here, and I'll try to keep it brief. But one of the things that I think is just painfully broken about Australia is that we do not invest in the sectors and in the education and in the people and in the workers that we need to provide some of our most basic services. You know, I fully agree that we need to rein in, migration, that it needs to come down to a level consistent with what you see in the US or what you see in Europe to pretty much a developed world level norm. But part of the problem here in Australia is everything has been so horrifically badly managed that we do need the extra nurses, that we do need the aged care workers. Now, a European style migration attack would still be more than enough, but we do need to train these people domestically, and these people need to be respected. They need to be they need to be adequately paid, and they need to be treated like the essential workers that they actually are, instead of just underpaid and just too often shafted, and just put in a corner because it's easier just to get people from overseas. And I think that in a lot of ways that particular issue is going to come home to roost as the population ages. A lot of the people who were in favor of, these systems are going to all of a sudden find that, well, this isn't going to work out too well when you reach that aged care home.
The critical thing to understand, I think, is that human capital is an asset, and an asset that needs to be invested in, right? And that means that the appropriate degree of training and support for people as they develop their skills is critically important. Unfortunately, in Australia, in my experience working inside large organizations in Australia, that CEOs weren't prepared to invest in those skills, because they always argue, well, I can always go to the market and I can find people who can actually do it without me having to build skills. What that means is that you have a more transitory environment in which you work. It means that you also have less of a career path as well, because that's not seen as important. So the really big strategic question here is how you manage human capital properly inside the work environment in Australia. And that's been broken for at least 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's also about how we as a society and how the government, and how policymakers value that human capital at an individual level. Like we can value, these CEOs even if they've failed upward their entire career. Yet I think about some of the people that I've known even in my life. Like one of my dad's best mates who unfortunately recently passed away. He was an aged care worker. He was an aged care nurse for a long, long time. Vietnam vet, military veteran. Fantastic guy. He never got paid the money he deserved. He did the backbreaking labor. Day after day, week after week, and instead of investing in, paying these people what they deserve, we just get people in from overseas, and then we underpay them and treat, and in some cases exploit these people. And I don't know. I just find that whole thing just horrifically ironic and just painfully stupid. The idea that we just, that so many people are just, yes, pro-migration, pro-migration. What about the migrants getting treated like crap? Well, and it's just like, oh my God, please, just some consistency would be lovely.
Yeah, well, it comes back to, again, the question we keep posing in these shows is, what sort of society do we want? Because there are decisions being taken, right, by politicians and by business leaders and all the business lobbies that actually drive society in a particular way. The question is that the sort of society we want? And I have said quite consistently, I think you have too, actually, there is a better path.
Yes, politicians just aren't interested in taking it.
Exactly. It's about winning the next election.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, speaking of pathways, this is from the recent CBA cost of living report, and it breaks down monthly per capita spending by age demographic. And well, I think this one pretty much speaks for itself. Basically from 35 onward, the older you get, the bigger your spending growth. And the hardest hit people in terms of reining in their spending are people aged 25 to 29. Now, my theory is most of these people aren't old enough or have enough cash to be homeowners. So my theory is that those people are most likely renters, and probably renters who are not doing all that well in terms of their real outcomes. And that is why we are seeing their wages, not their wages, their consumption fall away in nominal terms and really fall away, drop by over 7% for people aged 25 to 29.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the CBA analysis shows that it is discretionary and non-discretionary spending that's being squeezed in those younger cohorts, whereas discretionary spending is significantly more supported at the higher end. And going back to that Productivity Commission report, it showed, of course, that the distribution of assets in terms of property and also superannuation and shareholdings and those things was much higher at those older cohorts. In fact, I made a show about this yesterday. So it highlights the crushing pain among lower age cohorts at the moment, a lot of whom are renting or living with parents trying to save to buy something, relative to older generations. And interesting, if you go back 20, 30 years, the spending patterns were very, very different, because then it was the older cohorts that were spending way, way, way less. And an interesting observation, of course, also that those older cohorts on average have significantly higher government support through the pension schemes and other schemes. So you've got to ask the question again about how broke is in society based on what we're seeing here.
Indeed. And just while I provide a little bit of commentary, I just thought it'd be good to just have the next slide up. I think part of the issue with, with this lens and just this society as it is more broadly, is things are working as the government intended. The government wanted older people to have more in their retirement, to spend more in their retirement through the superannuation system, and that's exactly what they're getting. Because every block of retirees each year has had a year longer of compulsory super, for their super to grow, and for in a lot of cases to take advantage of what was, especially back in the day, some very, very, very fat, nice, juicy tax concessions. So it's not really surprising that this is happening. This was all intended to happen. The problem is that the economy for people who are younger is performing garbage, and it has been performing garbage for a long, long time. But I think that with the issues of the rental crisis, with higher rates, with just this economic slowdown that we're currently experiencing, it's just made it very clear of what works and what doesn't really.
Right. Well, I just want to underscore again what you said. This is a deliberate set of policies that were put in place some time ago, working out as intended, right? That's the problem. And again, it comes back to my fundamental point. It doesn't have to be like this. It's like this because of policy decisions that were taken by politicians, and by the way, by Treasury, who have a particular philosophical mindset and set of models that they actually use to try and sort of direct the economy, whoever is in power. But the consequences are pretty frightening. And if you run the script forward, more and more of those younger cohorts, as they move through their life, will be unable to buy property, will unable to build the same asset base as the current cohorts that are older are. So it's almost like the older generations are picking up the drawbridge and saying cheers, and leaving the younger generations to say, well, tough, you can't have it the same way.
I think that there needs to be something of a realization that people have been sold a lie. People have been told that if you work hard, that if you put in the hard yards, that if you do the same things that your parents did, you can have the same life, the same quality of, housing that your parents did. And that simply just is not the case. A recent report from from PropTrack, so realestate.com.au, concluded that the median earning household nationally can only afford 13% of properties listed for sale. Now, obviously, there's things with people building equity over time and yada, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is that if you're able to get into a property, into a house, and build equity in, say, 2000, it's very different to the apartment that someone is going to buy to build equity in 2024. It's a completely different kettle of fish. Now, we've seen something, say, for example, in Sydney, whereby if you had bought an apartment in 2018 with the hope of building equity in order to buy a freestanding house, that freestanding house is now further away today than it was 5 or 6 years ago, a lot further away. And, and that's despite the fact that these people have spent the last 5 or 6 years dutifully paying down their mortgage, playing the game, and doing what they were told to do and were told was a pathway to success. The problem is that if things continue the way they're going, where housing prices, in particular house prices, keep going up the way they are, that, there is a future, I think, whereby people buy an apartment in order to get their foot on the property ladder and slowly climb their way up the same way their parents did, who are going to get stuck in those apartments because they lack the means to make that jump to a house because they appreciate very, very differently over time.
Well, I think you've made a really important point there. And it's clear to me also that the prospect of home prices doing the same again for the next 20 years as the last 20 or 30 years is pretty low, not least because the income ratio and the income multiples that are required now to buy into property are much higher than they were. And if you actually extend that trend another 20 years, no property would be affordable for anybody pretty much. First point. Second point, of course, that the reason that property prices ran away was because interest rates were cut dramatically particularly from 2008 onwards, up and down a bit, but much lower. We had the deregulation of the financial system. We had all of the other things going on, and we had the tax concessions that were put in place. Now, they can't do the same again, right? But you can't expect, therefore, to see the same price growth ahead that we've had, which is a problem for many people who are banking on that. The other point is we've got a greater proportion of people now who are in the rental sector and will remain in the rental sector. So when they get into the retirement phase, they will still be in the rental sector, which means that they're going to have to continue to pay for accommodation. Because one of the interesting observations, again, in the Productivity Commission report was they said a lot of people, as they move into that later age cohorts, are not paying mortgage, they're not paying rent because they own their property outright. So their cost of owning a property and having somewhere to live goes down dramatically. Whereas for those in the rental sector, they have an ongoing issue, which means that ultimately they're going to have to end up pulling the government pension through end of life, and probably getting extra support from government to cover the costs of the rental property that they're actually renting. So again, it's another example of the snakes and ladders not working. Lots of snakes, little small ladders or no ladders.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing is there was a ladder, people just kicked it away, and now it's just like, well, you got to do it tough, buddy.
Yeah, spot on.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm currently working on probably the longest article I've ever written on the Australian construction sector, on basically, anything that you could poke a stick at. And part of that is comparing what is the actual output of the Australian construction sector compared with other countries. Now, in terms of comparing with itself, yes, Australia's construction sector, in terms of the number of homes per capita being built, is performing historically badly. There's no other way of putting it. That's very much the case. But compared with other countries, Australia is a housing construction juggernaut. For most of the 2010s, Australia built more homes per capita than the US and the UK put together. Yet somehow we have a housing shortage, even though we build more houses than almost anyone else. Funny that.
Well, you can also, if you overlay the migration trends as well, you know, guess what? Migration is a lot higher in Australia relative to other countries on a sort of per population basis. You know, there are 29,000 households in the UK and around 600,000 migrants, plus or minus 600, 700,000. There's 10 million in Australia, and migration somewhat similar. So you can sort of see the problem. I guess the other point there is that we always come back to this fundamental point about the structure of the Australian economy. There are two pillars. There's basically the housing pillar, and there's the holes pillar, right, which is the mining. It's a very narrow-based economy. And so those two legs of the stool support pretty much everything that goes on in Australia, which means, of course, that we're much more vulnerable if we do turn the volume down on migration or turn the volume down on housing construction on one side, or indeed if the mining sector goes off the boil. And what happens if both happens at the same time? That's part of the problem that we've got. Again, structurally, the economy in Australia is skewed, which is why so many bets have gone into the housing sector. And, you know, we are masters at building on a per capita basis. So, you know, the fact of the matter is, Tarric, is we have an economy that is overly reliant on those two things, on housing and construction and on the mining and resources sector. And I guess the question that I sometimes wrestle with is what happens ahead? You know, what's the playbook going to be? Because it looks to me as though relative to other countries, we are actually in a less advantageous position. I know that Chalmers is saying, well, we can invest in the the green machine, and you know, we'll place some bets on you know, quantum computing and on building you know, power cells in Australia, and particularly the photo cells. But you've got to ask the question, has the lucky country run out of luck?
I think that's a really pertinent question. And I think that part of the issue is what happens in terms of the construction sector versus the property sector. Now, I'm separating those into two different things because the property sector wants ever rising housing prices. You know, they want looser lending. They want all these different things. You know, that basically just means property price go up. But the problem for the construction sector is eventually prices get so high that it's no longer viable to build in such great numbers. And my question for the viewers, if they have experience with this or they have a take on this, I'd be very interested in seeing your comments, particularly, you know, sound off if you are in the industry. And this is the question to you as well, Martin, that what exactly happens when property prices rise and get so high and that we reach a point where it's no longer viable for a lot of people to build new homes? I mean, have we reached that point now, or are we nearing that point whereby, you know, the high peaks of the 2017 construction cycle aren't going to be, you know, ascended to again because we've reached this point where is building a house has it just gotten too expensive for it to be viable with, you know, sort of what you'd consider to be like normal historical interest rates?
Well, it's certainly true that many people can't afford, you know, to buy a new home even now. You know, the building and construction costs continue to rise, the labour costs continue to rise, and the trends are actually not looking good ahead. But of course, you've got to also counteract that by saying, well, of course, you then see proposals to try and help. You know, CBA's recent announcement to say, well, we'll actually, you know, provide a new funding model with another party to be able to actually make it more accessible for people with a smaller deposit to get in, or more government scheme. So the question becomes, will the government throw more stimulus into first owner grants or you know, direct support for the construction sector to try and actually keep the construction wheels turning whilst allowing home prices to continue to bubble higher? Will the lending rules be weakened, and there's a lot of pressure on APRA to weaken the lending rules to be able to actually lend more, because those sorts of levers can extend and pretend for a period of time. The question is, of course, at what point does it completely fall away, because the costs of actually building new stuff continues to rise.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's really sort of, my concern going forward, that, the property sector and the construction sector, are approaching not necessarily now, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10, but they are on a course where they are heading for mutually exclusive, outcomes, for what is in their interests. So it's going to be really interesting to see exactly how that ends up playing out in the end, because, they are both immensely politically powerful.
Yep.
In terms of, their influence that they wield in Canberra. So, I mean, I think eventually it will have to come down to what is it in terms of jobs, but it's going to be a hell of a war if they really get into it with each other.
Right. And just to underscore, we are building more homes per capita even now than most other countries. So it's not like, we've gone off the dial, but the approvals continue to drop. The completion times are blowing out. So it's taking a lot longer to actually get a property actually done. And the quality of construction continues to deteriorate. So none of the critical parameters, to my mind, are actually in the right place at the moment. But again, political decisions are being taken rather than actually maybe more strategic decisions. Part of that is that heavy lobbying from the construction and other just sectors. And there are some very, very big property owners who are still pushing the same old barrow.
Indeed, they are. Now, this, I think, is a really, really fascinating chart, and this will be included in my upcoming article on this on Substack. And it shows that basically historical dwelling completion cycles are actually relatively short. Downturns tend to last somewhere between 6 and 9 quarters, generally speaking. And I'm going to make an important distinction here. I'm talking about cycles before the global financial crisis, before we started to see the outsized intervention in the construction sector by the federal government. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always been a degree there, but it's gotten to a much, much greater level than it once was. Now, we used to have relatively quick cycles where, rates would rise, building activity would fall off, but then within, a year and a half, 2 years, 2.5 years, things would bounce back. And that's just the way that the cycle works. That's just economics. That's life. But as you can see there with the cycle beginning in Q3 of 2017, we are currently on quarter number 25 because government doesn't allow cycles to play out whereby you see things fall, you see demand get pent up, things bounce. Instead, we keep bringing demand forward, bringing demand forward, bringing demand forward with all the various first home buyer schemes, with home builder, with all these various different things that have brought forward demand again and again. And basically you end up with this flat spot whereby you've just brought forward all the demand, but there's no fuel there for a real strong recovery and completions. And that is one of my major concerns going forward, both for the economy and for housing supply. Because if they have brought forward all this enormous level of demand and created this essential pocket where there isn't a whole lot of demand going forward, what happens to the economy? And what happens to housing supply when we're still when we still have a government intent on running migration at a level that is significantly higher than the rest of the world?
Yeah, I'm sorry about the noise. You may have heard the dog in the background. Hey.
No dramas.
We have noisy neighbours. A car has arrived and the dog needs to alert us that there's a neighbour. No, Tarric, you're absolutely right. Again, it comes back to this is another of those structural issues there are a series of short-term political decisions taken, but nobody's actually thinking about the structural landscape. And again, it does come back to some really, really fundamental questions, again, about the nature of society. Where are people going to live? I ask the question quite often, well, is housing a human right, or is housing a speculative asset that you can bank on making more money over, right? I mean, it's a pretty critical question. At the moment, what we have is a series of speculative decisions being taken, and those speculative decisions really are not necessarily in the interest of ordinary Australians again. And it's another example of the snakes and ladders, right? So if you're in the property construction sector at the big end of town, you can probably get sufficient help from government directly or indirectly to continue to do well. But a lot of smaller construction players are actually up against it. Many are going out of business. Many people who've paid money across haven't got the property completed. Meanwhile, governments extend and pretend and don't allow cycles to actually cycle. They want to sort of, try and keep propping it all up. But eventually, the amount of taxpayer money that goes into the propping up of the property sector directly and indirectly is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. And if you look at where the money goes, you've got to question, is it going in the right place?
Yeah, yeah. And generally speaking, it's not, but such as Australia. Okay, now this is of the ratio of job applicants to job ads on the Seek index. Now, I know some of you will point out that that Seek has lost some market share and that this isn't perfect, and they would be correct. That's true, but Seek's issues are national, whereas this particular chart is of what's happening at the state-by-state level. Now, what it shows is that the labour market is deteriorating most significantly in Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT. If you look at Queensland and South Australia, on the other hand, that's roughly where things were prior to the pandemic. But in Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT, things are getting quite a bit more challenging. So it's going to be interesting to see how the outcomes diverge going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And again, I see that in some of my data. So the issue with regard to people getting more jobs, and multiple jobs is a thing for many people. They're finding it harder now in New South Wales, Victoria. But I'm also seeing the same worrying trends now in the ACT, where in the public sector things aren't too bad, but in the private sector they're actually going quite differently. By the way, the number of public servants continues to rise at the moment. So if you're in the public sector in the ACT, not only is your average income a lot higher, but you'll be fine. But in the private sector, particularly in Victoria is looking to me to be the basket case of the states at the moment for all sorts of reasons, not least the problem with more people trying to sell their properties and trying to get out, and other issues there as well. But it's worth just reflecting on how different it is in Western Australia and in Queensland, where in fact, things are quite different. In fact, home prices are continuing to bounce quite a lot higher in Western Australia and Queensland. But there are also some interesting signs there that things are beginning to wobble, but maybe slightly earlier. And by the way, Tasmania and what's gone on down in particularly in the Hobart property market is now looking pretty sick too. So it's really important to understand that you can't talk about Australia. You've got to talk about the individual locales.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is say, for example, Victoria and New South Wales in particular. It's very much a chart of property listings as well. You're seeing listings in the Adelaide market, in the Perth market, in the Brisbane market, still very, very weak compared with historical norms. But if you look at Sydney and Melbourne, you're seeing them, particularly in Melbourne, you're seeing them normalize with what they were, prior to the pandemic. So, it's very much created a multi-speed economy and a multi-speed property market, which I think is really going to be quite telling in the next say 18 months to 2 years, because people in New South Wales and Victoria do have these enormous mortgages that are going to continue to weigh regardless of whether or not rates are cut, I mean, even under, sort of a reasonable scenario, and if rates do get cut, they're still going to be weighing people down. And I think it's also the fact, and this is something that I think that needs a greater level of research put into, is how much economic activity is undermined and foregone because of people saving deposits. It raises a rather interesting question of what burden is that placing on the economy by people, holding off on consumption for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years of holding back and saving up for that property when in years gone by, in 3 or 4 years, they would have been done, they would have purchased the property and their wages would have grown and they would have ended up a whole lot better off than they were before. So it doesn't really make sense in that regard in terms of like there's this idea that rising property prices good forever, but I think that when you actually get into that particular nitty gritty, it's quite a different story.
I'll also add that, of course, that once you've bought a property, you tend to be quite a large purchaser of other goods to put in the property, right? And if that's being postponed as well. And so the latest retail numbers were actually pretty weak again. Surprise, surprise. No, not by me. So a lot of people don't have the money to spend on those things. They don't have the property to stuff other stuff into it. So effectively, I think that the negative drain on economic activity is probably being underestimated. Interesting question of how you'd measure it. There are probably ways, but certainly in my surveys, I see quite a few people who are in a cash flow positive position, but are choosing to put money aside to try and get into the property market. And they're either living at home or they're in the rental sector. And a lot of people in the rental sector are frightened by where rents are going and are deliberately trying to dig their way out by buying, which means saving. But there was a recent article, I think, from Finder that showed that in a couple of major centres, you were looking at 20 or 30 years. I think there was one that said you'll be able to buy a property when you're 62.
Yeah, it was 46 years of saving. 46 years of saving for a Sydney house. And I think a unit was 34 years of saving for the deposit.
Hmm.
I think one of the key things with the Finder numbers that the AMP and ANZ and everyone others numbers don't factor in is house price growth. All the others assume that property prices and incomes stay where they are, not that property prices continue to grow. There was some assumption that property prices would continue to grow. I mean, I've done my own numbers on this, even with say, for example, a Sydney household. But I chose Sydney because it has the highest median household income in Australia in terms of capital cities. But even with a 50% greater than median income, saving 15%, say 15% pre-tax of that income, the amount of time that it takes to save for a 20% deposit, if we assume property prices continue to rise at historic rates, is infinity, is forever. And I just think that that's just a little bit absurd, to be completely honest with you. But I guess that's what happens when you've got a system that, where the average is property prices rising, significantly faster than wages.
Yeah, the image I have is that you've got a whole bunch of people on a train, right? And they're all sitting there in their properties, and the train is accelerating away. And then you look back, and on the track, you see, some younger people running really hard to try and catch the train, right? But although the harder they run, the train is accelerating away further and further and further, and they end up never being able to catch the train. That, I think, is the analogy that I'd bring to the table at the moment as to what's happening.
It's just a bit ridiculous, really, because I think that there are a lot of factors that are going to be impacting the property sector and property prices in, let's call it, the next 10 years. But they're completely underappreciated by government, by policymakers. Or maybe they do know. Maybe they do know, and it's just all fantastic for them, and they really don't care. But one of the things that is going to continue to weigh on sort of outcomes for young people is the fact that more and more property is going to get locked up by older Australians who just are not going to sell. We're seeing, the hold time for property get longer and longer and longer. Turnover rates continue to fall. And to be completely honest, I don't blame people.
Hmm.
They worked hard. They got their house. They built their home. It's for their family. They want it there in case, their kids have to boomerang back or whatever. And that they have every right to that. I wouldn't dream of taking that away from people. But the thing is, government needs to use their brain and realize that that was always going to happen, and that the supply of houses for people with families needs to be greater. Or there needs to be some sort of mechanism whereby people are incentivized who do want to downsize. Because part of the problem at the moment is if you want to downsize from, say, a big 5-bedroom house into a 3-bedroom apartment or a 3-bedroom townhouse, most of those are relatively new builds, and most of those are quite expensive. So the net benefit of downsizing after all the fees and after everything's been paid is actually, in a lot of cases, remarkably small if you want to stay in that same area. So I just think in a lot of ways, policymakers have dropped a very, very obvious ball.
I think they've dropped quite a few. I'd say a whole basket of balls. But the truth is, of course, that the lobbying that's now going on to government to help people downsize into smaller properties. So just remind you, these are the people with the most equity, the most assets. There is now a heavy lobbying to encourage them to downsize. Hang on a moment. Why are you throwing money there? You got to ask the question. And I think you said if politicians use their brain. The problem is politicians have two brains, right? The first brain is, how do I get re-elected at the next election? That's the one that's predominant. The other brain, which is the social justice brain and the transformational economic, futures and what have you, and thinking about intergenerational equity and those sorts of things, that's the other brain. The trouble is that brain gets atrophied the more they're exposed to the political realities of the current system. And in fact, I've had quite a few conversations with politicians, some backbenchers who actually still have a very active second brain, that sort of social justice brain. But more and more the politicians are on the front bench and making the decisions. They've lost it because they're only interested in playing the political game of getting to the next election and trying to win the next election. And that comes back to this fundamental question of, if you actually have the political brain determining everything, then you get these stupid outcomes.
Yeah, it's really quite sad in a lot of ways because you see people go in with these, lofty ideas, and they just sort of get crushed by the sort of the realities of internal party politics. And it's really just got to the point now where for the longest time we've been able to rest on our laurels in Australia. We've had these enormous booms fall out of the sky. Not that we haven't had to do anything to earn them or to facilitate them. They've just happened. And we've had all these various things come in to benefit us. Even just the good governance and planning of governments from many, 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 many decades ago. People who overbuilt Australia's infrastructure to cope with the number of people, or well, I won't say cope, but to begin to cope with the number of people that the nation now has. Like you drive down some of the main thoroughfares in our cities. These were built in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. The water infrastructure is 50 plus years old. All these things that were built, that facilitated, the success and, the prosperity of our nation. But we're reaching a point now where we can no longer just rely on the successes of the past and the windfalls of the present. We've reached a point now whereby hard decisions need to be made. Because if you look at the data for so many different things, whether it's traffic congestion, whether it's emergency room wait times, or GP availability, or GP bulk billing availability, or all these different very important, vital even elements of our daily lives, they're deteriorating. And in some cases, they're deteriorating quite rapidly because of poor management. And we've reached a point now where I think we can't have another parliamentary term of doing nothing. These issues need to be addressed now before they go into, something of a tailspin, and then they just become so entrenched and potentially so politically expensive to fix that they won't get fixed.
No, I think you're right, Tarric. And my worry is, looking at what happened around the budget and post the budget, is all the behaviours from the politicians are, political brain on, social transformational brain off at the moment, which is a really big concern. There are some really, really important strategic questions that Australia and Australians need to ask. I think they need to be putting stronger pressure on their political representatives. And it's about laying some more strategic thoughts ahead as to how to deal with these big issues. Because I think, as I questioned earlier on, the lucky country, well, we could be at the end of that cycle. What happens next is going to be determined very much by the decisions that are taken over the next few years. And if, in fact, we don't get some maturity of thinking and some strategic vision stuff happening, the outlook probably doesn't look that flash, unfortunately. Well, Tarric, I want to say thank you very much. And, great to catch up with you again. Very important. And I think some significant strategic questions here that are worth exploring. I'll look forward to picking up the conversation next time. And folks, if you've got specific comments or observations on what we've said today, feel free to drop them in the comments below. We always read them and appreciate those. And we'll see you soon, Tarric.
Yeah, looking forward to it, mate.
Cheers.